Of course, in this course, we look at Plato and we look at Aristotle. These are the main characters, but we have looked at some others, and we're going to do that now as well, in looking a little bit at the play Antigone by Sophocles and comparing it to some things in Aristotle, but perhaps also with implications for Plato. Now, I'm not going to go through the details on the characters and the plot of Antigone, but generally, of course, there is this major conflict between Antigone, who wants to bury her brother, who's lying dead outside the city walls, and Creon, the king of Thebes, who forbids this because her brother Polyneikes has gone against the city, so he's not to be buried. He's to be left out to be eaten by wild birds and animals and just rot. And by the end of the play, of course, Antigone has been sentenced to death by Creon, and she has killed herself. And Creon is left after this cascade of death, and so he's left there with his daughter-in-law to be dead, his son dead, and his wife dead. All of them blaming him, and all of it pretty much in one way due to his actions and his choices. So it's really a classic tragedy, of course, in structure. Now, a very simple and simplified way of taking this, which has its origin in Hegel's 19th century interpretation, is to say quite simply that Antigone stands for the family and Creon stands for the state, and we see here how that ends tragically in the Aristotelian technical sense, when there is no mediation between the individual and the community. Now, that's seriously oversimplified for among other reasons, for the very reason that Creon is not only the state, he actually is also the chief of household for Antigone. So there is a lot of complexity there. But there's certainly, there is definitely something to it. This is an important feature of the tragedy. It's just that it's crucial to get the niceties of the machinery into play here. In asking about the tragedy, of course, it's important to keep in mind that it is, in a way, a very double tragedy. It starts out very much as Antigone's tragedy, and the title of the play is Antigone, but she sort of fades from view, and by the end, I think the audience or the reader's experience is that this is not least Creon's tragedy. So it really is it's one of very many doublings in the play. And the tragedy, according to Aristotle, who in his Poetics has provided us with a proper analysis of the classic Greek tragedy, according to him, a tragedy comes about. I mean, the tragedy as in the idea of a big shift in events, and according to Aristotle, this should be from better to worse. The course, at least part of the course, is somehow related to the protagonist, of course, to the agent. But it's important that that cause is not simply in the depravity of the protagonist. So if we now just use Aristotelian glasses in trying to understand Antigone, or at least offer an interpretation, that means that Creon, most of us would agree that he really messes up things, but he couldn't be seen as simply depraved. He rather is all in all an okay chap. And according to Aristotle, this is how it should be. Okay chap then, in the sense that he's more like us. He's fairly decent, at least at the outset. He's fairly decent. He's not completely vicious, and he's not like an animal. He's just someone who has an error, which is the usual translation of hamartia. Now, hamartia is this error, this flaw or fault committed by the protagonist, which leads everything from going, if not entirely well, then at least better than it does after the activation of that hamartia, the error. And so this is to Aristotle in his analysis. It's the hamartia that is kind of the engine of the action, and what it engenders is a shift from ignorance to knowledge, and in his kind of tragedy, the kind that he says is best, that also means from happiness to very much its opposite. So it can all, or at least an important part of it, should be traced back to the agent, to the protagonist, but that's not to say that the protagonist is all bad, but it's to say that the protagonist is not perfect. So in other words, more like us. This hamartia, of course, then has something to do with what we might in modern parlance call the self. There is something about the self or the character that is not that's not perfect. Hamartia, in fact, is also the term used in the New Testament and for sin. That's translated as sin. But here it's probably not sin in that sense. It's more like an error, or perhaps a flaw of character, somewhere between flaw of character and just a mistake. And the mistake is connected to ignorance. Clearly, in Aristotle's analysis, it's somehow your ignorance that is part of what makes you do what you do, and that leads everything into shifting and going more badly. What is crucial now in Aristotle's definition of tragedy is that part of his definition is in terms of two emotions, namely pity and fear. This is very important because we immediately then see how this is connected to what kind of character should be the protagonist. If the protagonist is an all-out, disgusting and awful person, then we won't feel pity and or with that character. We'll feel either nothing or disgust, or perhaps even something like good riddance if things go really badly with them. But the idea then is that we feel pity. And we feel pity for those who are somehow like ourselves. So the complexity here is such that in the protagonist in the play, according to Aristotle's theory, there is a shift from not realizing to realizing something crucial. In the audience, there is also some kind of realization through the cognition of the emotions, through this experience of pity, of a community with that person, of us being like him or like her. And when Aristotle says pity and fear, that's because pity and fear really are this close as emotions. The only real difference between pity and fear is that the occasions where you will feel pity if something bad happens to someone else are the occasions where you would feel fear if they happen to yourself. So since you're then watching or reading about this happening to someone like yourself, the experience of pity is already very, very close to an experience of fear, which will then also be a kind of a learning experience for yourself as audience. So what is it that happens then? If we look only, this is a very complex tragedy, the Antigone, but if we look only at Creon, what is it that happens? Well, if we take as a point of departure the idea that he insisted earlier on that only the state matters, and he is the state because he's the boss, he's the king, right? Only the state matters, and these ideas that Antigone has about respecting her brother and family ties and all of that, that's nothing. It's really just nothing. His decree as king is what matters. Isn't what is being taught to him through his own actions coming back at him, quite simply, that was never true? Because his own grief, his own terror, his own sorrow is caused, not least, by him losing his family. I mean, his son commits suicide because he was supposed to marry Antigone, who's then sent off for execution by Creon. And when Haemon's, that is the son's mother, hears of this, she blames Creon and kills herself as well. So in the end, the actions of Creon come back to him and hit him in such a way that he realizes that he was never, like he said, he was never that simple. He too lives through family, and family is important. Something like that, at least. That would be part of the insight that happened. So what is this all about then? Well, it's an insight into what we, again, might, with modern parlance, call the self. Who are you? What are your roles? What is really your identity? What are your functions and assignments, and how do you carry them out well in such a way that you respect and live up to all of these things? Clearly, that's just what he hadn't done. Now, that's not to say that Antigone was right about everything, because she's a deeply problematic and probably flawed character herself. But this is not the occasion to go into that. I'm just trying to point out some basic ideas here about how this tragedy, through Aristotle's reading of it, of the structure of tragedy, can help us see something both about relating to oneself and about relating to the other extreme, namely the political community. And in this context, then, we can also appreciate just the name of Haemon, Creon's son, who is now dead. Haemon really is pretty much just a form of the word blood, which to the Greeks is a way of expressing just that, family relations. So this idea of your actions not exactly happening to you, but at least you not knowing your actions, not knowing fully what we might call values of what you're doing and what you're undoing, and how that comes back to you because you didn't really know yourself. You didn't really know your own limitations, your own place, your own responsibilities, and your own roles. You weren't able to think of these things as a proper whole, and appreciate them in that way. The limitations are, of course, very existential in the play, but there is also a very strong choral passage in the play, around 332 to 375 lines, where the incredible force and power and the awesomeness of human beings is laid out with something that looks like a lot of optimism. But it's also interesting to notice that the two major limitations here, namely that even the best of crafts can be used in two directions. That's the first one. And secondly, in the end, what you cannot escape from is death. So there is something about this whole passage, this whole song, that is on a very general level, sketching out what we then see in this quasi particularized way when it comes to the characters of Antigone and Polyneikes and Creon and Ismene and Teresos and the other characters in the play. In this connection, then, of course, we should also bring in Aristotle's own words, because this is all read through Aristotle's theoretical lenses from the Poetics. Aristotle's own words about poetry being more philosophical than history. And that's because although poetry and a tragedy like Antigone is about particulars in one way, there's this woman called Antigone and there's this man who's the king called Creon. These are almost just name tags with a certain character fleshed out. What the tragedy is showing us, according to Aristotle, and this is a necessary thing in order for it to work at all, in order for it to fulfill its function, which has to do with pity and fear, it has to be always already universalized. And so that's Aristotle's claim too, that poetry aims for the universal, even though it's all wrapped up in the form of what looks like particulars. This then, of course, happens both if you look at directly at the action of the tragedy, and when you look at how it affects the audience, the realization and the learning experience that might be there for the audience. That it's not just what did you get out of the Antigone? It's not just, well, I learned that Antigone, and then you just start telling the story. There's also something more universal that you learn, something about yourself, something about what it means to be human and what it means to live up to one's roles. A final word in this connection on mimesis, because all of this is mimesis, and it's as mimesis, that is as dramatization, as not just copying, but as setting up this drama, that the play is a mimesis of something in real life, of something that's true about how human life is. And so part of what we see here is that mimesis is very important, and it has a huge potential for shaping us. And in fact, Aristotle says that that's how we start learning as children in the world. We start learning simply through mimesis, through dramatizing, enacting, through representations, through seeing that this is that things are the same. All of this is a kind of mimetic form of learning. And of course, the art of poetry more generally and of tragedy specifically is very much an instance of a professionalized mimesis. And so when we then, in this rather complex situation, try to understand something about human beings by looking at Aristotle's analysis of the Antigone, we see that the idea of mimesis as a way of grasping, of giving shape to, universalizing and grasping deep truths about human life is really what Aristotle is appreciating when it comes to a work like the Antigone.